Well, we are officially halfway through the season 2 of The Hybrid Disciple. Welcome to everybody out there. I'm Andy. I'm one of your hosts. I'm going to be joined by Ashley in just a few short moments, and we have another interview / special guest with us, Miss Jay Medina. Now, Jay is different than every other guest we've had and every other guest we will have going forward. And we typically don't like bringing on, representative people speaking for whole groups of people because, people are people, man. People have different opinions and even inside different groups and different generations and different age ranges, things vary wildly. But Jay actually is of the Gen Z population, meaning that she's younger than both Ashley and I by a decent bit. And not only that, she's driven. She is accomplished. She just graduated from FIU, which is Florida International University. She is interested in digital communications and media and marketing and all of those things. She has been working with and interning with Univision, like the largest Spanish-speaking television network in the world. And on top of all that, she's a Jesus lover. And so we wanted to bring her on the show to really talk about the views of kind of Gen Z and church and how media and social media and mass market communications are actually informing a lot of what has been happening behind the scenes and in front of the scenes in terms of Christianity for generations that are behind us. So sit back and relax. This is a good one. She is extremely well-spoken. She has such a good heart for the Lord. And on top of all that, she really knows what she wants to be doing with her life. So all of that being said, sit back and relax with this episode with Jay Medina. We've been doing a lot of these so far, Ashley. A lot of these awesome interviews in season 2 of The Hybrid Disciple with people that I don't think we actually were able to really comprehend how they were doing ministry and how they were bridging the gap between physical and digital until recently. And you, Ashley, are the brains behind pretty much all of this show because of your drive, and yes, you are, and everything that is happening there. But actually, Jay is one of your friends, and so if you don't mind, introduce her to the rest of the Hybrid Disciplites that are listening here.
Yes. So this is Miss Jay Medina, and I had the privilege of working with her on another project called Crazy God Stories, which is sort of a podcast television show merger. And I'm honestly not sure how much I'm allowed to talk about it yet because it's still in production legal land. And so they're sorting out where it's going to air, et cetera. But in that time, I was able to just sit down with Jay and another co-host and get to know her a little bit. And really, she loves Jesus first and foremost, which is amazing. And then she's spent the last 5 years of her life studying media, essentially. And so whenever it came to determining who the guest should be for this season, I was really excited to invite her on because I think she's able to speak into everything that we're talking about, one, from a Gen Z young millennial perspective, and additionally, from a media perspective. And I think that hearing her point of view specifically on why young people are leaving traditional religious situations and spaces, and also how media so profoundly impacts a generation is just going to be really an interesting topic for us to talk about. And so thank you, Jay, so much for coming on. And if you want to introduce yourself, fill in any gaps that I may have missed, that would be great.
Hello, everyone. So happy to be here. Thankful for Andy and Ashley for reaching out. And, as Ashley said, the past 5 years, I've been, finishing my degree in digital media and communications. A little bit about me, I would say that I am a born and raised church girl. And with that comes a lot in the territory. And, in my adulthood, just kind of seeing and discovering, who is Jesus to me. And because sometimes we're raised in the church and we don't even know who Jesus is to us. So I'm so happy to be here and I'm so excited.
Now, Jay, we were just talking off camera, and you just graduated from FIU. You have a degree in communications, is that right?
It's digital media and communications.
Digital media and communications. What made you want to get into that? Do you like being on camera? Do you like writing scripts? Like, are you a journalist? Where are you headed with that?
So I consider myself a multimedia journalist. And I love being involved in content anywhere from writing news articles to being in front of the camera, being behind the camera, producing. And what really made me get into that is I have always enjoyed news. And I think another thing that really inspired me is I'm originally from New York, and being in such a diverse environment where everyone has a different story and everyone comes from a different place, that just really made me fall in love with people's stories and storytelling. And so all of that brought me to pursue that kind of degree. And like I said, today I consider myself multimedia journalist in a way that's not traditional because, I don't want to be a reporter in front of the news, and that's just not where I see myself. But because of media and because of the way it's grown, you don't have to be in front of the camera on ABC News to be a journalist. And so that's where I'm at with that.
Amazing. And I think it's very cool. I think because I grew up in the Southwest, and so like Univision is such a huge news source, entertainment source here. And so you've been able to do some work with them, which I think a lot of times white America specifically doesn't necessarily know what a superpower that organization is specifically whenever it comes to influence and just cultural significance, specifically in the Latino community. And so speak to that a little bit, like from a diversity perspective, how you see multimedia in the United States and in Gen Z specifically, because like every child in my house is multi-ethnic, multiracial, and that's sort of the United States is very much moving there. And so how do you feel like Univision and organizations like Univision are really kind of supporting that movement, but then also generationally, what does that diversity look like from a media perspective?
So I would say, Univision, they are, they're the number one media producer in the Spanish language, not just nationally, but internationally. And I grew up watching this content, being very familiar with it. My family is Puerto Rican, and my culture is something that's so special to me. And actually, growing up, I felt like there was a divide between English media and Spanish media, and all things English and Spanish. And I even felt that sometimes because this divide was very difficult to deal with because I identify with both. I'm American. I'm born and raised in New York, and I'm proud. But then also, like, I'm Puerto Rican, and I'm super proud of that culture, and I'm super proud of everything beautiful that comes with that. And it kind of hurt me to see a divide in the media between the English and Spanish. And that's also something that inspired me into journalism, is kind of like representing a Puerto Rican girl from New York, and also bridging the gap between the English and the Spanish, because I think I'm particularly in a special position where I can relate to both, and I can close the gap and bridge between the two communities. Univision, they're very aware of the impact that they've been having, especially in recent years, where, like you said, this is where more, our country is going towards, and the population of mixed people and multi-ethnic people is growing tremendously. And they're really trying to use this time to launch themselves forward to not just being, the number one Spanish producer, and just marketing themselves to everyone. And I really love that diversity. I loved working with them. They really are some of the most intelligent media professionals, and they know not only how to reach their own community. Because something that I think also maybe, the words you said before, white America may not understand, is that the Latino community is extremely diverse. People from the Caribbean and people from Central America and people from South America, we all have we may speak the same language, but I can listen to someone speaking from Chile and I literally will not have a clue what they're talking about. So it's really impressive how Univision has been able to unify the Latinos, because Latinos, yes, we share a lot, but there's also so much that separates us. So I know that as they continue to move forward and trying to make themselves available and market themselves to all kinds of communities, that's something that they're good at, because Latinos are more different than other people may realize.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct in that. I have one of my very best friends on earth is from Uruguay, and then my kids are Mexican, and whenever you start just discussing the intricacies of those two spaces, Maria, my friend, she'll be like, what? Like, why did they do that? That doesn't make any kind of sense. And I'm like, well, I don't know. And she's like, that makes no kind of sense. And I'm like, and people will tell her like, well, isn't like Mexican and Uruguayan the same? And she's like, no, like, no, absolutely not. Like, her mom is from Italy originally, and then but her dad is from Uruguay. She grew up in Montevideo, and like, it's just. And then I have lived in Asunción in Paraguay and have traveled all over Central and South America and the Caribbean. And I'll say, like, you're absolutely right. Like, if you're having a conversation with a Dominican versus someone from, Colombia, it's not.
It's totally different. And I think also I felt like I need to be that person to tell the American side. Because like I said, I relate with both. Like, listen, it's not the same. We're not all the same. Each country has its own dialect, food, culture, music. And there's so much that we share. There's so much that we do share. We do share music. We do share media. But like you said, it's more intricate than what people think.
Absolutely. So pivoting from that a little bit, you mentioned that you were a church kid, grew up in church, and then you have gone through this process of figuring out who Christ was to you specifically. Can you speak on that a little bit?
Yes. So I was raised in a Pentecostal church full of mostly Puerto Ricans. It's a Spanish church in Queens, New York. And I attended that church for the first 20 years of my life before I moved to Florida. And my parents met in that church in the 80s. My dad had attended that church since he was 7 years old. My whole family was in that church. My uncle still is to this day the senior pastor of that church. My parents were always involved. I was always involved. So I grew up in a very tight-knit community, and it was an amazing experience. People have a lot to say about the Pentecostal church, and I do myself also have a lot to say about the Pentecostal church. But in my experience, I had a great childhood. I had a great experience in church. There were people that loved me. There were people that poured into me. I feel very blessed with the experience that I had. And it's not that I would ever look back at that and say, oh, the Pentecostal church, like, there's obviously things wrong. But the way I kind of look at it is I'm like, okay, I'm at an age, I'm an adult. Is this, I could never look back and regret my childhood or wish that it was different. But I think now maybe I look at it and I say, okay, what can I do differently for myself as an adult, in what kind of church community that I want to be a part of? And one day when I have children, what kind of environment would I want them to be in? But I would say that I was raised in a super close-knit community, very loving, a lot of God-fearing people who always poured into me and really set the foundation for my faith. Because, like I said, I was in that same church for 20 years. My parents were in that church for like 40 years. all my cousins, my uncles, everyone in my family was in that church. So that was the kind of experience, more or less, that I had.
And now that as an adult, and obviously leaving New York and being in a completely new environment, and then obviously working in media, because one thing about working in media is you get a very diverse group of opinions and perspectives and creatives. And as a creative, I can say this with confidence, we're a little weird sometimes, like you almost have to be a little bit weird to be a creative, because you're sharing vantage points that other people haven't ever identified with or seen before. And you have to have like the courage and frankly, the audacity sometimes to like put your creation out there. And so whenever you moved to Florida and you started working through your degree and meeting all of these different creatives and people that I'm sure were also studying in your field, and then also reflecting on your upbringing and that faith foundation, did you have any moments where you were like, I'm not even sure if that works for me?
It's so crazy that you asking me this question, because it really is something that I dealt with, and it's something that I'm still, taking to prayer and praying about, like, God, what do you want from me? What kind of environment am I supposed to be seeking in terms of like a church environment? And, back to what you said about, working in media and it being a crazy environment. And I'll even take it a step further and say, when you're working in a news environment, it takes it to the next level of people's opinions, of the pressure that's surrounding the work, the environment. It's really, really crazy. And it will make you, especially as a young person like me, leaving their hometown, it will make you question who you are, what do you believe, and what do you want with your life? And I definitely experienced that. I think, all glory to God. By the time I got to Florida, it's actually my testimony of coming to Florida is a story in itself, which maybe we can get into later. But by the time I was really getting into these media spaces, I knew who God was to me. I did not doubt who God was in my life. I knew that I knew Jesus was my savior. I knew that I wanted my life to be following his will for me. So I was never confused about that. But what I did get confused about was my relationship with church. I was not confused about my relationship with God. I was confused about my relationship with church. And that's something that it's really hard, especially when like I said, when you grow up in this tight church community. And let me tell you, growing up, we were in church. I don't know if you know how Pentecostals are, but we were in church like 4 days a week, sometimes more. Sunday was like from 9 a.m. to 5. It was like the whole deal. And I grew up with that. So when you grow up in that, like, church was literally a part of our everyday life. I'm in my early 20s, and now I'm like, what is my relationship with church? So it's difficult, and it's something that today I'm still navigating. And I think there was a time where it even discouraged me from going to church, because I just had so many difficult feelings about church. And like I said, my difficult feelings were not towards God. I knew who God was to me. And at a time I was discouraged from going to church. And, after just praying every night and being like, God, I want to be where you have me to be. And it's not that, and I remember even telling God, it's not that I don't love you. It's not that I don't love church, but it's just like, where am I supposed to be? Where's the community that I fit in? And I just decided at a certain point, I'm like, you know what? I'm not going to let my personal issue with church keep me from showing up. Because when I show up to church, it's not about me. It's not about the pastor. It's not about the people sitting next to me. I'm going, and that's my worship, showing up no matter how difficult my feelings were. So that's kind of the mindset that I've adapted the past couple of months. I'm just going to keep showing up. I'm going to keep being faithful not to the church, but faithful to God. And I know that God will lead me. He'll take me he'll remove me if he has to, and he'll lead me to the right people and to the right community. So that's, where I've been at with that.
Yeah. And I think that actually is very much, as I work with Gen Z a lot, and what I hear over and over and over again is like, I believe in God. Me and God are cool. Like, I have no problems with God. Like, I believe in Jesus. As some of them do, some of them don't. God seems to be a pretty solid, like, people know, like, I believe that God is and that he's in control, and I am absolutely cool with that. And then there's others that feel the exact same way about Christ, right? But what I hear over and over and over with young people is like, but church, like, my relationship with church is just not there. And so Andy has some statistics that Barna, a research organization, released about 2023, and he's going to share those with all of us. And then we can kind of pivot from there, because I think it's interesting to hear from you that exact thing, because it's backed up with research. And then additionally, like, for those listening, statistically, like, we need to not only recognize that this is a very real thing that's happening, but also take the time to listen to young people like yourself, to the why. Like, why is that happening? And how do we start chipping away at these statistics that Andy's going to share with us?
Yeah, it's really kind of unsurprising that you stepped through that, Jay, and are kind of going through that same thing. So Barna and Pew, which are two big survey houses in the United States, routinely are going through kind of Christians, particularly, Pew is definitely like a Christian focused research center. And every year they kind of do this updated list of everything that's been happening, and they call it their National Public Opinion Reference Survey, which is like a really dumb name for what they're actually doing, because what they're going through and they're asking people to do is identify their religious beliefs. And so from 2007 to 2023, I have a graph, and I'll share all this stuff in the show notes as well. But in 2007, 16% of the United States adults, these are just adults, 16% identified religiously as atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. Particularly the none is what they're routinely called. So that's 16% in 2007. Fast forward to 2023, we have now almost doubled in that. 28% of U.S. adults are now religiously unaffiliated, which, okay, we can kind of see that. We can kind of feel that. We can kind of feel that the United States is drifting away. The nuns, as they're called, are now the largest religious cohort in America. So 28% of U.S. adults don't identify with anything. They're the nuns. 24% identify as Protestants, and 23% identify as Catholics. In the 1980s, the nuns were only 5%. So that's a huge, huge growth. But the interesting thing about that is that of those nuns, it used to be like, oh, a lot of them are atheists or agnostic and kind of all of that. Actually, the surprising thing is that only 17% of them are atheist. 63% of them identify as nothing in particular, which means that they're not anti-religious. They're not anti-God. They're just sort of nothing. And it's kind of like you were mentioning there, Jay. They have a real weird relationship with the church. Their parents or their grandparents or their community really impressed a lot of church upon them, but didn't give them a whole lot of expectation, didn't give them a whole lot of rationale behind why we spend from 9 to 5 on a Sunday, which is supposedly one of my days off, why I have to go to this church and essentially do another job. They didn't do all of those other things. And so the nuns now in particular are citing skepticism and disbelief as reasons that they're not religious. Not that they don't believe in God, but they just don't believe in the church. And so I ask you, Jay, I kind of put that back on you and like ask you really two things. Number one, you said that you had a weird relationship with church. Where do you stand on that right now? Number one. And number two, do you see that from the people that you used to work with in media and Univision and things like that, but also in your kind of community around you, the people of your age around you? Are you feeling that coming back at you?
I would say right now, my relationship with church, and this is coming from the perspective of someone that church was instilled in me. We did not miss church. ever growing up. Church was our priority. Church to me today is still my priority. You could say that maybe that's because the way I was raised. You can say that that's, just instilled in me. Maybe it is. Church is a priority in my life because I love the community. I love the power of the local church. When you go to the local church and they're, helping the community, I love being a part of that. I think my question for myself has been, what kind of church do I see myself in? Is it Pentecostal? I'm raised Pentecostal, but that doesn't mean I have to be Pentecostal forever. My question has more been, what kind of church? But for me and in my life, church is important. It's always been important to me. That's something that was instilled in me. And I think for me, church in some capacity, even if it's not like the one that I grew up in, is important to me. I would say, especially in Univision, I would say from what I know in my experience, Latinos generally have some sort of religious installment in their childhood. Whether they regularly attended church or they didn't, most Latinos do have a religious upbringing, even if it's in the slightest of praying or, that kind of thing. So I do feel that I see a lot where, church, God is involved in that community. And I think I saw this in Univision, or the people that I knew in Miami, which is obviously a very Latino place. God is mentioned, religion is brought up, but there is a disconnect between the people who are talking about God and if they're actually attending church or a part of some sort of community. And I would say in my community, in the community that I was raised in, I do see people having the same kind of questions that I've had. People who were also raised in church, raised doing ministry within the four walls of church. A lot of people my age have had these questions. And, some people, I've seen people leave. I've seen people totally leave the church. I've seen people totally leave the faith. I've seen people who are just confused with church. I've seen people who are confused with God. I've definitely seen an array of confusion and different things that people are confused about. And it's, like you said, I think back in my parents' generation, like I said, my parents went to my church in New York. They were members there for 40 years. My grandma, she moved to New York from Puerto Rico. And when my dad was a little kid, they started attending church. My dad was 7 years old. My dad attended that church from the point that he was 7 years old to when we moved to Florida 2 years ago. And I look back in my dad's generation, and I don't know if this is the culture, just the culture of New York or being Latino in New York, but it was either like my grandparents' thoughts was like, either we raise our kids in church or they're going to be in the street. So I think maybe that's why in that generation, there wasn't that big of a people leaving. People were not leaving as much, because to my grandparents and in my parents' generation, it's like, okay, we're going to raise our kids in church, because if we're not raising them in church, they're going to be in the street and they're going to succumb to a different lifestyle. So in my generation, we definitely are seeing an exodus in a way that my parents' generation didn't. And I've experienced it in my personal life and in the people around me.
I think it's an interesting, because I am a Southern Baptist church kid. So that means same thing as you, like my parents were the music ministers. My dad's a deacon. My grandfather was a deacon. And church, you just went to church and there was no question. Like there was not an option to not go. Like if I had ever even dreamed of telling my mom that I think I'm just not going to go today, they would have been like, what? Like, first off, who gave you permission to have an opinion on what you're going to do? You don't have an opinion, like what you want is inconsequential here. Like, and so I think some of it, on some level, I think that we have raised, and I mean, I have 2 adult children now, which is crazy to say, but like my 20-year-old and my 18-year-old, there has been a major shift in the way that we parent, right? Because we're much more keen on like mental health. I actually have taught my children that you should question authority some of the time. Like, do it respectfully. Don't come at me sideways, because that's not going to go well for you. There's still like enough of the old school parenting in me that but like, I want them to question, I want them to reason things out, and I want whatever it is they believe to be because they've actually thought it through. And so I think that we're kind of dealing with a couple of different things here whenever we're speaking specifically about Gen Z. I think one of them is we just parent people differently. Like, we don't, parents of Gen X and older millennials that now have kids that are aging into adulthood. I think that we just realized, like, some of our parents' tactics were really, really not healthy, and so trying to shift that, though, you can't say, okay, kid, I want you to think for yourself here, here, and here, but don't question God. Like, it doesn't work. Like, you either raise them to be self-thinkers or you don't. Like, there's no in between. And then the other thing is, I think that there's a couple of things that I have seen, having grown up in church, having completely left the church, which Jay's very familiar with my story, but having completely left the church and then coming back and having a firsthand encounter with Christ that radically demonstrated to me who he was directly without the lens of religion. And I think that that second piece is something that, from a big picture perspective, the church really needs to evaluate. And that's a couple of things. First, that it has to be about God first. It can't be about the show. It can't be about the lights. It can't be about the pastor. It can't be about how dope your youth ministry is. It has to be, how do we as a body introduce people to who Christ is and the power that he brings and the transformation that he offers if you're willing to step into that space with him, regardless of everything else. And I think that, and I may step on some toes, I think we've lost that a little bit in Western church, because we have gotten so focused on, for lack of a better word, entertainment, that and making people feel comfortable and good, that I think sometimes we've lost a little bit of that, like, old school, like, hey, this is what the truth is, like, and not to say that we want to go around beating people over the head or forcing them into things that they don't want to be part of, but like, this is the truth. The truth is, if you live this way and you go down this path, this is what's going to happen. But there's another way. And so there's that element. And then I think the other thing is, and we actually were talking about this with one of our guests earlier in the week, and that is, we are so incredibly careful to not show our mess ever. And we have a whole group of leaders and seasoned believers who just want to appear to the masses like we have arrived and like nothing, we've never done anything bad. We don't struggle with anything. We don't question ever. And I feel like the generation that you are a part of is so hungry for just authenticity and the ability to watch the transformation in someone else so that they can see that this is something that's actually real. This isn't some perfectly curated person who's standing on a stage telling me that Jesus is beautiful and life is beautiful and everything is beautiful. It's people who are willing to step out and say, like, I was an addict. And I still sometimes will wake up after 15 years and think to myself, like, man, I would really like a hit of whatever it was that they were addicted to. And this is how I go to God in those moments and allow him to minister to me and allow him to transform my life. Or, I do it all the time on my TikTok. Like, and in the very first episode of this podcast, I said, some people are addicted to drugs, some people are addicted to alcohol. I was addicted to having casual, dangerous sex with random strangers from the internet because it was something that was like left over from the lifestyle that I had led, right? And I haven't been an escort in 10 years. I have a completely different life, like studied freaking theology in college. Like, it's a completely different life, right? But there are still to this day moments whenever I'm feeling lonely or bored or whatever it is, where I'm like, you know what? I would really like to just hook up with some random stranger. And I'm like, whoa, where did that come from? And how do I deal with that? And allowing people to see me process through that honestly, so that other people are like, oh, she hasn't arrived. Like, she has struggles just like I have struggles. But this is how God works in her and through her. So obviously that's a very long-winded way to ask you, what do you think the Gen Z specifically needs to be able to see in the capital C church in America to feel A, like they are welcome there, regardless of what it is that they have going on, and B, to help them understand, like, this is salvation and sanctification are not the same thing. Salvation happens immediately. Sanctification is an ongoing process. And there is not a pastor in a pulpit anywhere in America that has arrived like ever. And if you're listening and your pastor acts like that, you should probably leave and go to a different church, because they are lying to you. So if you would speak on that a little bit.
First, I would just want to say I resonate literally with every word that you said. And something I do think it all comes down to answer the question in a short way. I do think it comes down to authenticity. I think it all comes down to authenticity. And I know that in my personal walk, and I think maybe this is why I was so drawn to you, Ashley, like in my personal walk, I look for the authenticity. I love people who are just, I love people that, as unconventional they may be, they just do their thing and they do it for God. I just love people who they do their thing and they do it for God, and that's it. Because there's always a mold, and especially when you grow up in church, you see this mold. This is what it takes to be a pastor, and this is what it takes to be a leader, and you do things like this, and you look like this. I'm not saying there's anything inherently wrong with, having standards and, in a church and wanting people to represent the church in a specific way. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think that part can get really tiring for young people. Because it's just, sometimes it feels like they're just singing the same song again and again, and it's not real. Sometimes that's how it feels to young people. So I think I could speak for so many young people when I say I want to see people who are unconventional, doing their thing and doing it for God. Because it's like, I think also when you keep this mold of this is what it takes to be a leader and this is what it takes to be a Christian, you're kind of instilling shame among the congregation, or it can be taken that way, where it's like, I'm not talking about the ugly parts because there's shame. So then and I'm looking at that and I'm like, man, should I be ashamed? Should I be ashamed of my ugly parts? And I do think what young people need to see in the church is authenticity. And I'm not going to sit here and also act like Gen Z is so amazing and we're so smart and like we know everything, because I am in a way traditional. And I do believe in rules, and I do believe in, like you said, there's truth. We cannot be living our lives based off of a feeling. There's truth that we need to hold ourselves accountable to. And I think maybe my generation, they don't want to be held accountable in many things. So I can't sit here and act like, Gen Z, we're like, we know what we're talking about. But I think that we want to see authenticity. And maybe that authenticity will kind of help us bring our guard down to be held accountable. But it's like hard to be held accountable by people who you feel like are not being real.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that Ashley and I have talked about actually in this, and it's really cool to hear you say that. So the Hybrid Disciple is all about, making disciples first and foremost. Like that's our job as Christians, is to go and make disciples. Doesn't matter if you're just fresh out of the water, like fresh off of saying yes to Jesus, I'm following you, or if you've been following him, dyed in the wool since you were 1 year old and you're 85 and you're going to meet your Savior soon. Like, that's our job, is to go and make disciples. And if you look at the early church, I've been like heavily studying the early church. I've been preaching on it and kind of teaching on it at Lux and doing a whole bunch of other stuff. But the early church, by and large, was pretty authentic. Like Peter, if you look at who Peter was, he was like a super bonehead. Like, he didn't really have a filter. He just kind of stood up and said what he thought and put his foot in his mouth like a bunch. But like, people followed that. People resonated with that. There was no real airs. Even Jesus said, like, hey, follow me. And then the rest of the Pharisees at the time were like, wait a minute, these guys didn't go to college. These are ordinary, unskilled, unschooled men. Like, what's going on here? None of them really put on airs. Even Paul, who probably was like a super bummer to hang out with because he was so authentic. Like, there was this thing of just like, I don't know, this is me, and you just need to walk closely with me because like Jesus accepted me and Jesus is going to accept you. And it's funny, I'm sitting here getting a whole bunch of messages through Instagram and through TikTok and everything right now as we're doing this. And I'm starting to like sit here and put two and two together. Like, man, maybe you, Jay, are not feeling that authenticity because of things like social media, because of, us always having to put on a filter, always having to put on a face, always having to put on a front, a false front to somebody. Do you, when you're interacting, especially with social media and things like that, do you feel like you're constantly having to put forward that face and stop being like Peter and stop being like the original apostles? Or do you feel like you're just being your authentic, true self right now?
I feel that it's very easy to fall into putting on a filter, and it's very easy to be putting on a face. I am someone that I value authenticity. That is like one of the things that's a priority in my life. So I try to regularly check myself, because I can't expect other people. You have to be the change that you want to see. I know I want to see other people be authentic. I have to be authentic. I have to present myself authentically. I have to make sure to align myself with things that are authentic to my purpose and my mission and what God has for me. But it's definitely very easy to put on a filter, especially in social media, where we're trying to present something, especially when you're working in media, where we're trying to sell something, we're trying to push a brand image, or we're trying to, there's an ulterior motive to we're not posting, brands aren't posting a specific post just because they want to post it. There's a goal. There's a goal that's trying to be met, whether it's sales, whether it's views, whether it's engagement and promoting something. So it's very easy to fall into that. And my way of, and I'm still new, I'm freshly graduated from college. I'm still new in this industry. The way I've tried to combat it is just by working with people and working on projects that align with me. If it doesn't align with me, if I don't feel comfortable doing it, I won't do it. If I would feel like I wouldn't want my parents to know that I'm doing it, or my close friends to know that I'm doing it because it goes against who I am, then I will not do it, because it's very easy to fall into that, for whether if it's for money or just views, attention. And yeah, it's hard. And I definitely see that it's something very easy to fall into. And because I know that, I'm extra careful about where I put myself.
Yeah. So as we wrap up on time, I guess what I would like you to close out talking about is, for the different church leadership and people that listen to the podcast, who recognize the mass exodus of young millennials and Gen Z from the church, and who genuinely have a heart to strategically make decisions and plan ways to get these young people re-engaged, what would your advice to them be specifically?
I would say, don't try and be a coach. Try to be a friend. Listen, and insert your comments in a timely way, and in a respectful way with love. Don't think that you are just like the all-knowing and because I think something else that really turns me off is when people come to me trying to be like a savior. Like, oh, God wanted me to tell you. And listen, I'm not saying that God didn't. Maybe God can tell you to tell me something. But when you come with like this like savior complex, immediate turn off. It doesn't feel authentic. It doesn't feel, for me, like when someone starts with coming to me with that savior complex, I'm kind of like, okay, like I'm good. Be a friend. Be a listener. And if you have something on your heart that you would like to share, pray about it first, and do it in a way that is with love and that is intentional. Don't think that you are there to save that person. Don't have that mentality. Just listen and be a friend. I think that that's like the number one thing. Listen and be a friend. And that in itself, that love that you approach that person with will show your heart. It'll show. And that in itself is something that can change someone's mind. That's something that can really deeply impact someone. When I think about the times that people came to me to correct me, maybe they were right. Maybe down the line, I think back and I'm like, okay, that person, they were right. They corrected me. But there's just something so special about the person who comes in patience and comes in love and comes just to love me. And, I think both have their place. But if our goal is to get Gen Z and millennials back into the church, we need to be their friend and we need to love them and we need to be patient. And that's what I would say.
Yeah, that's really good. I don't remember who said it, but there's a woman that said the biggest problem with the church today is that we try to cook a fish before we've caught it. And so we sit here and we try to get people, not just Gen Z and millennials, but people in general, to act and to follow and ascribe to the teachings of Christ, but they have never in their life professed to know or even want to know him. And then we yell at them because they are not living the way that Christ said that we're supposed to live. But the truth of the matter is they don't know him. They have never asked to know him. And so we are trying to hold them to a set of standards that they never agreed to follow in the first place. And then we start condemning them for that. When in reality, accountability without relationship is judgment. Mm-hmm. You can't try to hold somebody accountable to something that you don't have a relationship with them in the first place to be able to speak into their life at all. So to your point, like, you're absolutely right. Like, to align ourselves with people just to get to know them and be friends with them and say, like, hey, what are your thoughts on this? And what are your thoughts on that? Without automatically assuming that they know or even want to know Christ, because that's something that Jesus, I think, we miss. Jesus never chased anyone down and was like, listen to me. He never did that. You never read in the Bible where he's like chasing down, the drunkard and being like, this is really wrong. Like, he didn't do that. Like, he allowed people to come to him. He asked them a zillion questions because, he asked more questions than he gave statements. And I think whenever you give people the space to share who they are with you and you build that relationship with them, then you're able to speak into their life on a much more impactful way without coming across as like a psycho.
Yeah, I agree 100%. That in itself makes a world of a difference. Just being genuine, just wanting to love that person without speaking over them, like when you just meet them, or calling them abruptly and being like, so that, I think that's really one of the key things that need to be taken away from this topic.